The near half-dozen Star Wars games I've played this year cover an almost equal number of different genres, spanning from vehicle-based action-adventures, first-person shooters, 2 major single-player RPGs, and a full-on MMO. Probably the most notable category omission here to round out a great year of Star Wars gaming is a starfighter combat game, a genre which Star Wars has represented plenty of times in decades past, but at a decreasing rate as the years go on. Early 90s simulations like X-Wing and TIE Fighter, and later games like Rogue Squadron and its sequels fill out a pantheon of flight games ranging anywhere from hardcore simulation to pick-up-and-play arcadey fun. So along comes Star Wars Squadrons, a game that feels like it sits somewhere in between these two styles of sim and arcade, but is a whole lot closer to the former than I think I was expecting. Now, that surface level comparison is about as deep as I can go when examining this game in relation to other games that have you warring among the stars. The TIE Fighters and Rogue Squadrons of the world are games that I've dabbled with at times but never dug into or played to completion. My hour count among all Star Wars flying games I've played prior to this review probably numbers somewhere in the single digits. So I'm approaching Squadrons as a fan of video games first, a fan of Star Wars second, and a flight enthusiast dead last. I also don't have a flight stick, so I'm in the minority of reviewers playing this on a regular gamepad. And all of this I'm sharing with you so you have full context of the perspective I can tackle this review from. I'm one of the many millions of gamers who aren't the direct TIE Fighter loving, flight stick owning target audience, but I'm maybe a few inches away from the bullseye. The video gaming Star Wars fan who wasn't quite sure if this game was going to be for them when they bought it. After over 30 hours of gameplay, I finally have solidified my thoughts on Star Wars Squadrons. This game is cool. Strapping into the cockpit of any of Star Wars Squadron's 10 ships will have you face to face with dozens of different lights and buttons, but the selling point here is that these levers and baubles aren't just vanity. Instead, almost every visible part of your ship's interior is a diegetic piece of the UI, relaying information about speed, shields, health, boost, ammo, and the power management that's making all of those things tick. It's not exactly something you can pick up and be immediately competent at without a little bit of effort or prior experience with the genre, which is why playing the campaign or at least a few bot matches before hopping into multiplayer is something I highly recommend. The game slowly introduces more and more concepts and techniques as you progress further into the campaign, and the sheer quantity of things to learn is intense. Squadrons was still giving me additional basic movement commands after 6 of its 14 missions, and that was just a simple click of the controls. But all the complexities you need to overcome in understanding the full breadth of your capabilities is a challenge worth undertaking, because not a single aspect of this game's controls feel wasted. That complexity isn't bogging the game down, but instead arming you with a bevy of fleshed out options to pilot effectively. Every enemy starship killed is well earned because of that full autonomous control over your ship, and it's why ramping up high kill streaks in this game gave me a rush like no other. The simple things like just turning around have depth, with you needing to pull back on the throttle to hit that sweet spot in terms of speed and maneuverability before you start banking left or right. Power can be routed with the D-pad at a moment's notice to give you the damage, health, or speed you need to combat a certain situation. Shields can be prioritized to the front or back of your ship to account for your enemy's relative location. Targets move at such high speeds that aiming at them depends on you pointing your reticle multiple feet in front of them. All of the above and more are concerns while simultaneously flying through space, with no real concept of up or down. This game is a blast, but it's sometimes a tricky blast. Even its default control scheme on a standard gamepad feels like it's breathing for air. Not only is every single button used, but some have additional commands mapped to holds and rapid double presses. Seriously, I got dumpstered for hours in multiplayer before I finally started getting a grip, but once I got that grip, I held on tight. There are 2 major ways you can engage in Squadrons as multiplayer. The simplest of the 2 is Dogfight, which is just a team deathmatch mode. First to hit a kill threshold wins. The second of the modes, and the one that is utilized within the game's ranked/competitive PvP, is Fleet Battles. Much like Squadrons itself, fleet battles have a bit of a learning curve, but it's a curve you're going to want to overcome if you have interest in the game. In addition to having the players flying around in their starship, each team has a capital ship sitting at either end of a rectangular map, 2 smaller ships defending it, and a whole bunch of NPC-controlled weaker ships that fill out the map. Teams alternate between attack and defense depending on how many kills they acquire, with additional kills pushing the line of scrimmage forward, allowing you and your NPC-controlled ships to push into enemy territory. What keeps this engaging is that, in addition to the excellent core controls and flying that make the game so special, an additional macro hero shooter level is introduced because of the ship archetypes. Your basic TIE fighters and X-Wings are complemented by bomber and support style ships. These alternate ship types have heightened purpose when needing to take down heavily armored enemy flagships and their subsystems. Additional considerations need to be made with each ship's loadout as well, as your missiles, shields, hull, and more can be customized to adjust the way each ship handles. The best fleet battles were tense back and forths as Empire and Republic alternate between dropping as many bombs as possible on enemy capital ships, and then quickly retreating to prevent their opponent from doing the same. The multiplayer modes get wrapped up in a simple progression framework as well. In addition to being able to climb up the multiplayer ranks, you're able to unlock a variety of cosmetic features like different paint jobs for your ship, small interior baubles, sprays, etc. I ended up spending a lot more time in the multiplayer than I do in most other games, and for that I commend Star Wars Squadrons. But the real reason I came to this game was for its single player campaign, and it's a campaign that makes some interesting decisions. The namesake of Star Wars Squadrons are the 2 aerial combat teams you're going to be playing as during the campaign, one fighting for the Empire and one fighting for the Republic. You're given missions that are usually multi-phase firefights, and in between these missions you can hang out at the hangar. It's these hangar sequences where the game reminds you it's not a full-priced title from EA. Launching at $40 with a presumably much smaller budget than any of EA's other Star Wars titles, it's clear that sequences like this are where corners were cut. The dialogue with your partners is all fully voiced and the voice acting is all top-notch, but the player character isn't voiced. In groups things are fine, but in one-on-one conversations things feel a little static, with characters monologuing at you while you awkwardly stand there and move the camera around. The hangar itself isn't explorable either. You sort of navigate like an old point-and-click adventure PC game, moving your cursor over what you want to interact with and then pressing A. Overall, it's presentation that's serviceable, and serviceable is how I feel about the actual story itself, too. As you alternate between perspectives of Empire and Republic, your missions continue to escalate in terms of story impact, as you try to undo or get ahead of the other team's progress. My biggest disappointment is that this escalation never really reaches the heights that it should. The indirect back and forth between teams stays indirect till the very end, and in what feels like an attempt to give both sides a positive/winning ending, it feels like the game just sort of fizzles out story-wise. Maybe I'm in the minority for my expectations with this story, and even though it wasn't everything I hoped for, it still has some unique set pieces and interesting little character moments that are worth playing at least one time through. I think the biggest virtue of the campaign, aside from being a great vehicle to engage with the game's excellent core gameplay, is the surprising map diversity. All of its 14 missions are out in space, with you never entering the atmosphere of a single planet. And despite that, Squadrons manages to give these maps a splash of color, influenced by the system you're in, or something a step further, like a level that takes place in a ship graveyard. A little over 8 hours into the campaign is when I got the credits to roll, and shortly thereafter I jumped in to do some of the missions again. Squadrons has some of the same sort of completionist hooks you'd expect out of any game with concrete missions. There are challenges you can complete by beating these missions in a certain time frame, doing certain bonus objectives, so on. I was hoping to maybe experiment and do some of the missions differently, but the same exact missions that entertained me well enough on a first playthrough didn't hold up to a subsequent. Normally short mission-based games like this, I try to run it back and experiment and see if my skills improved enough to make a notable difference, but that became less appealing to me as I started to uncover how surprisingly rigid this game's objectives are. Some missions give you the option to pick which class or fighter you want to fly as well as what loadout, but it hardly makes a difference with how linearly these missions are structured. Rather than giving you an overarching objective, the game drip feeds you with one small objective after the other. Tail this fighter, kill this subsystem, go to this specific point, etc. Pre-mission briefings are required as well, and though they can be skipped through, you need to do so one line at a time, meaning that any additional missions you want to replay are going to be preceded by a minute's worth of spam clicking buttons or just sitting through the same briefings you've already heard. It's a small complaint, but with how short the campaign is, I think the fact that repeat playthroughs are so boring hurts this more than it would have if the campaign was meatier. It's clear that the story mode here is just sort of a preamble and training ground for the game's multiplayer, which is fine, it's just something you should be aware of going in. In many ways, it's clear that Star Wars Squadrons is not a full-price $60 AAA game, but what makes it worthwhile is when it tricks you into thinking it is. Some of what exists at the fringe of Squadrons may not impress, but when you're in the cockpit, nothing else matters. What budget is here was surgically applied to the most important bits. The core feeling and agency you have when flying around these ships is exhilarating, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Much like the Rebels' Death Star trench run, Star Wars Squadrons is incredibly narrow but well executed, and I'm really glad it blew up.